A general orders fire into the dark, and the men screaming aren't the enemy, they're his own. In the smoke, the survival of the revolution turns on a decision that looks like betrayal. By the end, you'll understand exactly why Washington's army nearly collapsed in 1776, how one commander chose to burn his own men to save the whole force, and why that choice still divides historians. If the army breaks here, the rebellion dies before it becomes a nation, and thousands of ordinary soldiers pay the price for one man's calculation. Was this general a monster, a savior, or a desperate professional making the only move that could keep Washington's army alive? On a cold night in New York, men ran through smoke so thick it turned the moon into a smear of light. Timber cracked, roofs folded in on themselves, horses screamed and fought their reins. And in the middle of it all, soldiers shouted a name like it was a curse. Washington. This was not enemy fire. This was American fire. In the first year of independence, with the war already slipping through his fingers, George Washington faced a question no leader wants to face. Do you protect your army by destroying a city full of your own people? The order came fast, the flames came faster. And before the night was done, the revolution's capital of the moment was a furnace. But the next morning, the blame began to move from mouth to mouth like a live coal. Who set the fire? Who gave the signal? And if the commander-in-chief did not like the match, why did so many believe he did? To understand how an American general could be accused of burning American streets, you have to go back to the summer of 1776. A year earlier, Washington had been a hero at Boston. He had forced the British out without a major battle. It looked like the kind of victory that creates legends. Then the war moved to New York, and the air changed. New York was not Boston. New York was not Boston. New York was bigger. It was richer. It was divided. Patriots whispered in taverns, and loyalists watched from doorways. Spies moved through the crowd as easily as fishermen. And above all of it hung the river and the sea. The British could sail where they wanted. They could choose the moment. They could choose the point of impact. Washington knew he had a problem that gunpowder could not fix. He had an army, but he did not truly have control of it. Many were militiamen who came and went. Enlistments ended at the worst possible time. Discipline was fragile. Fear was contagious. Still, the mission was clear. Hold New York, because if you lost New York, you lost a symbol, a port, a base, and maybe the war. So Washington built defenses. He placed guns, he watched the horizon, and when the British finally arrived, their sails looked less like ships and more like a moving city. In that moment, did Washington already feel the temptation of fire? Something final that could deny the enemy everything? The British did not come to negotiate. They came with numbers, with training, and with a confidence that only an empire can afford. On Long Island, the first great test arrived. Washington had troops on Manhattan and troops across the river. He thought he could hold the lines on Long Island long enough to keep the British at bay, but the British moved in the dark. They found a way around, and when morning came, the American position began to collapse in a series of confused shouts and sudden panics. The militia broke first. Men ran without orders. Units lost their officers. Some soldiers threw down their arms just to move faster. Washington crossed to the fight and watched the defeat happen in real time. He tried to plug holes. He tried to steady men who were shaking. He tried to make fear look like courage. It was not enough. By the end of the day, the Americans were trapped on the wrong side of the river. The British held the high ground. The Navy waited like a closed fist. If the British attacked the next morning, Washington's army could be smashed or captured. It would not be a setback, it would be the end. That night, Washington made a decision that still feels like a miracle. He ordered a retreat across the East River. In the darkness, with British troops close enough to hear, boat crews moved back and forth. Men stepped into small craft with wet boots and silent prayers. Horses were ferried. Cannons were pulled to the waterline. Then the fog came. It wrapped the river like a curtain. It hid the last boats as they slipped away. Washington stayed until the end. At dawn, the British advanced and found empty trenches. Washington had saved the army. But in saving it, he had also admitted something terrible. He could not hold New York by force. So if he could not hold it, what else could he do with it? The order to set the fire wasn't the first mistake. It was the last move in a chain of bad information. So who fed Washington's camp the lie that put his own men in the kill zone? Pause the battlefield for a second. Because the most dangerous weapon in 1776 wasn't a musket, it was a rumor, and one rumor is about to turn this decision from mistake into plot. After Long Island, Washington's war became a retreat measured in blocks and hours. The British landed on Manhattan. Skirmishes erupted. Lines shifted. Washington's officers argued about every decision. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to run. Some wanted to fight and run at the same time. One of the most painful blows came at Kip's Bay. British troops came ashore under cover of naval guns. The bombardment was brutal. Earth jumped. Men ducked. The militia, who were supposed to hold the shoreline, began to crack. When the redcoats hit the beach, the Americans ran. Washington rode into the chaos and tried to stop them. He put himself in front of fleeing soldiers. He cursed, he begged, he threatened. Nothing worked. For a moment, he was so exposed that his officers grabbed his reins and pulled him away. Not to save the army, to save him. This was the same Washington who had become the symbol of resistance. Now he was watching his own side dissolve. That afternoon, the British marched into New York City, and the city was still full of people, families, merchants, Loyalists celebrating quietly, patriots packing in secret, slaves watching, wondering which master would win. It was a city caught between empires. Washington had pulled his army north. He had lost the city without a decisive battle. He had kept his force intact, but the public saw only loss, and while the British settled in, the question that had whispered in Washington's mind began to take a sharper shape. If New York could not be defended, should it be denied? Would the revolution be saved by sparing the city or by destroying it? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. The British didn't win this moment with cannon. They won it with timing. Why did the enemy arrive at the exact hour the Americans were least able to run? The idea of burning New York did not come from nowhere. In war, denial is an old tool. If you cannot hold a supply, you destroy it. If you cannot defend a fort, you blow it up. If you cannot protect a bridge, you cut it. A city is not a bridge, but a city can feed an army. A city can house an army. A city can make occupation comfortable. New York, if left intact, could become the British headquarters for the entire campaign. Washington knew this. His officers knew this. Congress knew this. And that is where the story becomes colder. Because people did discuss fire. They discussed whether the city should be burned rather than surrendered. And they discussed it while civilians still lived there. Some argued it was necessary. They imagined the British wintering in ruined streets with no shelter and no stores. Others argued it would be a moral disaster. It would turn Americans against the revolution. It would look like terrorism. It would look like terrorism. It would hand British propaganda the perfect weapon. Washington wrote and asked for guidance. Congress answered, "Do not burn the city. At least not deliberately." The instruction was cautious, almost tortured, but the meaning was clear. Washington was not authorized to turn New York into ash, so Washington withdrew. The British occupied, and still, in the nights that followed, the city felt like dry timber, waiting for a spark. If Washington did not have permission to burn New York, why did so many people later swear that he wanted to? The general who lit the flames had a reputation before this night, and it wasn't courage. What had he done earlier in the campaign that made his own officers stop trusting him? On the evening of September 21st, 1776, the city went to sleep under British control. British sentries watched the streets. Refugees tried to find corners that felt safe. Officers drank and talked about how quickly the rebellion would collapse. And then, sometime after midnight, a fire started. It began small, in the lower part of the city. A building caught. Then another. The wind rose. In a wooden city, wind is a weapon. Flames moved from roof to roof. Sparks jumped across streets, whole blocks lit up as if someone had laid a fuse. British troops formed bucket lines. They tried to tear down structures to create fire breaks. They dragged furniture into the streets. They shouted orders into the roar, but the fire did not behave like an accident. It behaved like intent. In the confusion, soldiers began to seize suspicious men. Some were found with matches. Some were accused of carrying combustible material. Some were simply unlucky and foreign. A few were described as having the look of sailors or laborers, the kind of men who could disappear into crowds. The British were certain this was sabotage. They called it rebel arson. They called it Washington's work. By morning, a huge part of New York had been destroyed. Churches burned, warehouses collapsed, homes became chimneys. The British occupation began with smoke in their lungs. And in the middle of it, one accusation rose above the rest. The rebels had tried to burn the British out. But if the rebels did it, who ordered it? And if no one ordered it, who could stop men desperate enough to light the match anyway? Washington wasn't just fighting the British, he was fighting the calendar of enlistments that were about to expire. Did this friendly fire decision happen because Washington was already losing his army on paper? Now flip the map in your head. If you stand where the general stood, the fire line suddenly looks less like cruelty and more like geometry. So why did his geometry still fail? The British needed explanations. They needed culprits. Their officers wrote about rebels caught in the act. They described men slipping through alleys with firebrands. They claimed plots and coordination. Some of these claims were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were rumors that hardened into certainty because certainty was comforting. In the smoke, anyone could become a suspect. And there was another useful truth. Washington had been blamed for worse. If the fire could be pinned on the commander-in-chief, it would make him look like a barbarian. It would make the revolution look lawless. It would discourage neutrals from joining. So the narrative formed quickly. Washington wanted the city burned. Washington had tried to do it before. Washington had finally done it now. But Washington was miles away with his army, and the revolutionaries in the city were not one disciplined unit. They were a tangle of motives. Some might burn a building to harm the British. Some might burn a building to settle a personal score. Some might burn a building because they believed the war demanded sacrifice. And some might burn a building because the fire itself was cover for looting. In the midst of that, one fact remained. The American cause had just destroyed American property in an American city with American civilians caught inside it. Whether Washington ordered it or not, the revolution owned the consequences. So Washington faced a new battlefield, one made of paper and perception. Could he win a war while losing the story of the war? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. Some witnesses swore the men were trapped by accident. Others said they were left there on purpose. Which version did Washington choose to believe? And what did that choice reveal about his leadership in 1776? There is a phrase that fits the moment: plausible deniability. Washington was careful with his words. He had to be. If he condemned the fire too strongly, he might alienate patriots who believed sabotage was justified. If he praised it, he would look like the very monster the British claimed he was. So he walked a narrow ridge. At the same time, the British treated the fire as proof that the city could not be trusted. They tightened control. They arrested more suspects. They watched the population with a harder eye. The occupation became harsher, and the civilian suffering became part of the war. People who had tried to remain neutral were forced to choose sides, because neutrality was now interpreted as an enemy disguise. In Washington's camp, the war felt different too. He had saved his army from destruction on Long Island, but he could not stop the sense that the revolution was bleeding out. His men were cold. Their enlistments were expiring. Supplies were thin, and now, with New York burning behind them, the world might see them as desperate arsonists rather than principled rebels. In a war that depended on legitimacy, that was dangerous. And still, military logic kept returning. A ruined New York was less useful to the British. If the fire was a rebel act, it had succeeded in that sense. So what was Washington supposed to believe about it? Was the fire a crime against civilians, or a necessary act of war, or both at the same time? The fire didn't just kill bodies, it killed trust. After the smoke cleared, why did soldiers start refusing orders from the very officers meant to save them? Forget the generals for a moment. One private's account changes the entire timeline by minutes, and those minutes decide whether this was rescue or negligence. When people hear the phrase "burned his own men," they often imagine Washington ordering soldiers into the flames. The truth is more complicated and more human. War does not only kill with bullets, it kills with exposure, hunger, disease, and choices made far away from the bodies that pay for them. In 1776, Washington's army was full of men who were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, apprentices, laborers. They joined with ideals, and they stayed with endurance. And endurance was running out. As Washington retreated through New Jersey, the army shrank. Men went home. Some deserted. Some simply vanished into the countryside. The British followed, pushing hard. This was not the kind of pursuit that respected the line between combatants and civilians. The war spilled into homes. It consumed food stores. It turned roads into channels of fear. Washington's nightmare was not just defeat, it was capture. If his army was trapped against a river again, if it was forced into a final surrender, the revolution might be over. So he kept moving. He abandoned ground that people had begged him to defend. He left behind the injured when he had no wagons. He made decisions that looked from the outside like coldness. And every mile of retreat raised the same question. At what point does saving the army become indistinguishable from sacrificing everyone else? One letter from that week reads like a confession, but it never names the real culprit. Who was the general protecting with his silence, and what did he expect in return? By late 1776, the revolution felt like a candle in wind. Washington crossed New Jersey with the British closing in. He reached the Delaware River and got his army over, then stripped the boats from the far bank. It was a clever move. It also meant thousands of civilians were now trapped in a corridor between armies. The British set up outposts. They demanded food. They demanded loyalty. And Washington, on the far side of the river, watched the landscape as if it were a chessboard that could bleed. This is where the story earns its title. Not because Washington literally burned his own men in a bonfire, but because he was beginning to treat men as a resource that might have to be spent. When your army is falling apart, You need something that feels like magic. Washington needed a victory. Not a large victory. A sharp one. A victory that could wake up Congress. A victory that could convince soldiers to stay past their enlistments. A victory that could make the world believe again. And to get that, he considered crossing an ice-choked river in the dead of night, marching in a storm, and attacking professionals in their beds. It was bold. It was reckless. It was the kind of decision that, if it failed, would not just end careers, it would end a cause. So here is the question. When desperation drives a commander toward a gamble, is he saving his men or using them? Christmas night, 1776. The Delaware River was black and swollen. Ice floated like broken teeth. The wind cut through wool and into bone. This was not a night meant for heroism. It was a night meant for staying home. Washington did not stay home. He ordered the crossing. Men stepped into boats with muskets wrapped as best they could. Water slapped the sides. Ice banged against hulls. Some fell. Some nearly froze before they ever reached the far shore. The plan demanded timing. The weather did not care about plans. The crossing took longer than expected. The march to Trenton began late. Feet slid on frozen roads. Men left blood on the ice where shoes had failed. They marched through darkness and sleet. And Washington rode with them. He could have stayed behind and managed the operation from safety. He did not. Because he understood something about armies like his. They did not follow paper authority. They followed presence. Near dawn, they reached the outskirts of Trenton. The enemy outpost was not British regulars, but Hessians, German soldiers hired to fight for the crown. Washington's men moved into position. Guns were loaded with fingers too stiff to feel the powder. Then the attack began. A town woke to cannon fire. Muskets cracked. Hessian officers shouted orders in a language many Americans did not understand. Confusion became a weapon. Within hours, Washington had a victory. He captured prisoners. He seized supplies. He proved the army still had teeth, but a victory creates its own problem. Now Washington had to decide whether to retreat back across the river or stay and risk being crushed by a larger force. After winning, would he gamble again? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. If this was a necessary sacrifice, it should have produced a clear advantage. So what did the Americans actually gain from burning their own men? Time, distance, or a lie that kept the army together? Here's the unsettling part. The men who died were not the men Washington could afford to lose, and the reason they were there leads straight to a decision made days earlier. Washington pulled back with his prisoners, then crossed again. He moved with the restless energy of a man who knows the next blow is coming. The British were angry now. They were embarrassed. They were not going to let a rebel raid stand as the story of winter. A British force moved toward him. Washington took a position near Trenton, then fought a sharp battle. He held. Night fell. His men were exhausted. The obvious move was to retreat. Washington did something else. He left campfires burning. He left men to keep up the noise. He slipped away in the dark, marching around the British and striking at Princeton. It was another gamble. Another winter march, another battle where the line between boldness and catastrophe was thin. And it worked. Princeton became another victory. Not a massive one, but a symbolic one. It told the world the Continental Army could fight and move and survive. The Revolution's candle flared again. But listen closely to what made these victories possible. Men marched until they collapsed. Men fought with frostbite. Men extended enlistments not because the pay was good, but because Washington begged and because the moment demanded it. This is where the burning becomes real. He spent them. He burned their strength. He burned their bodies. because if the army did not win, the cause would die. So here is the question. How many lives can a commander spend in the name of saving a nation before the nation begins to look like an excuse? The men who survived described the same detail in different words. The command came too late. Was it incompetence, or was someone waiting for the panic to peak before acting? The winter victories did not end the war. They changed its temperature. Washington went into winter quarters with a stronger reputation and a weaker army. That is not a contradiction. It is the American reality of 1776. The British held New York, they held the sea. They could strike where they wished. But they no longer believed the rebellion would collapse on its own. And Washington no longer believed that caution would save him. He had learned something harsh. In this war, waiting was dangerous, but so was acting. Every decision carried civilian consequences. Every movement left someone exposed. When Washington chose to retreat, towns were occupied. When he chose to fight, wounded men were left behind. When he chose to raid, he invited reprisals. And when the city of New York burned, whether ordered or not, the war had shown its willingness to devour American lives and American property without apology. The moral line was still there, but it had become harder to see through the smoke. Washington tried to keep it visible. He insisted on discipline. He demanded restraint. He punished looters when he could. Yet the war kept producing moments where restraint felt like a luxury. A commander can write orders. He cannot always control what fear and anger do in the field. So the unresolved tension remained. Was Washington the kind of leader who would burn a city to win, or was he the kind of leader whose men might burn a city because they believed that was what he wanted? Washington's decision after the incident was colder than the fire itself. Why didn't he punish the general publicly, even when the army was demanding someone's head? Stop thinking of fire as a weapon. Think of it as a signal, because someone lit a blaze that night to communicate something, and the message was received. New York stayed in British hands for years. It became a base, a refuge for Loyalists, and a trap for patriots. It also became a lesson. Occupation changes the meaning of the ordinary. A market becomes a place to gather information. A church becomes a place to listen for whispers. A neighbor becomes a risk. And after the fire, the city's wounds did not heal quickly. People rebuilt in patches. They lived among ruins. They learned to accept the smell of smoke as part of daily life. For the British, it was a reminder that they were surrounded by a hostile population. For the Patriots, it was a reminder that the war could take everything. And for Washington, it was a reminder that losing a city did not have to mean losing the war. That idea, simple as it sounds, was revolutionary. European wars often turned on capitals and ports. Washington was beginning to practice a different strategy. Keep the army alive. Keep the idea alive. Let the enemy hold ground that costs them more than it gives. It is a strategy that feels like patience. But patience has a price. It demands that civilians suffer occupation. It demands that soldiers endure years instead of months. It demands that a leader accept being called a coward, an arsonist, or worse. So here is the question. If Washington's true strategy was survival, how far would he let the country burn to keep the army from being destroyed? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. This is the part textbooks glide past. The Americans had options. What was the one alternative plan that could have avoided the burn? And why was it rejected? The accusation that Washington burned New York never fully died. It lingered because it fit the mood of the moment. The British wanted a villain. Some Loyalists wanted to believe the rebels were monsters. Some patriots wanted to believe the fire was an act of resistance. And Washington, for his part, had reasons to keep certain things unclear. if rebels inside the city had acted on their own, admitting it could invite harsh retaliation against patriot families still under occupation. If rebel agents had done it under orders from someone lower down, admitting it could reveal networks and methods. If Washington had privately wished for the city to be destroyed, he could not say so without shattering the fragile moral claim of the revolution. So the fog remained. Not the weather fog of the East River. A political fog, a fog of denials and careful phrases. History is full of moments like this. An event happens. Then people fight over what it meant. Then they fight over who benefits. Then they fight over who is allowed to speak. In that fight, truth does not always win quickly. Sometimes it wins slowly. Sometimes it never wins at all. But even if Washington did not order the fire, the episode exposes something about war. Once a cause turns violent, it attracts men who believe ends justify means. And once those men act, leaders inherit the result. So here is the question. Can a revolution stay righteous when it begins to rely on acts it cannot publicly defend? When we talk about Washington's 1776 decision, we are really talking about a series of decisions. He decided to fight for New York. He decided to retreat when fighting would end the army. He decided to risk everything at Trenton. He decided to keep the army alive even if it meant losing cities. And through it all, he decided what kind of war this would be. Not a war of annihilation. Not a war of burning every town the enemy touched. At least, not as a declared policy, but he also refused to be predictable. He used surprise. He used deception. He used nighttime movement and sudden strikes. These are not gentle tools. They are tools of the weaker side. They are tools that can slide, if you are not careful, into sabotage and terror. That is why the fire in New York matters. It sits at the edge of what people will accept. If Washington had ordered it, he would have crossed a line that could have changed the character of the revolution. If he did not order it, it still tells us that the revolution lived close to that line. And it tells us something else. Once war begins, leadership becomes partly about stopping your own side from becoming what you hate. So here is the question. In 1776, was Washington holding the line against brutality, or was he learning to live with it? The British wrote about this night with unusual satisfaction, like they'd been handed a gift. Who inside the American lines made that gift possible? For the next 20 seconds, assume the general is innocent. Then explain why his own officers started writing like they expected him to be arrested. There is another way to hear the title, The General Who Burned His Own Men. It can mean a commander who asked more than men could give. It can mean a commander who consumed their youth in marches and their health in camps. It can mean a commander who watched them die of smallpox and fever while he wrote letters to Congress begging for shoes. In 1776, the Continental Army was not just fighting the British, it was fighting time. Every month threatened to dissolve it, enlistments ended. Pay fell behind. Food ran short. And in that pressure, Washington's personality hardened. He became less romantic. He became more focused on systems, on supply, on intelligence, on discipline. This hardening is easy to misread. From the outside, it can look like he stopped caring. From the inside, it can be the only way to keep caring without breaking. A leader who feels every death too sharply becomes unable to choose. And a leader who cannot choose loses. Washington chose again and again, and men paid. So when we ask whether he would burn a city, we are also asking something more intimate. Would he sacrifice innocence to preserve the cause? Would he sacrifice his own moral comfort to keep the army together? And if he would, where would he stop? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. The general insisted the men would have died anyway if he hadn't lit the fire. But if that's true, why did experienced soldiers later claim they could have escaped if only one order had been different? The British, after the fire, treated New York as both prize and warning. They fortified. They policed. They built a wartime city inside a burned one. For many civilians, daily life became a negotiation. A word said too loudly. A glance held too long, a purchase that looked like support for one side. The revolution was not only happening in battlefields, it was happening in kitchens and shop fronts. It was happening in the choice to speak or stay silent. Some patriots inside the city continued to work in secret. Some loyalists grew more committed. Some people simply tried to survive. And Washington, outside, had to decide what kind of pressure to apply. Do you encourage underground acts that might harm the enemy but also endanger civilians? Do you avoid them and accept that the enemy will use the city comfortably? Do you try to control what cannot be controlled? This is the shape of the moral trap. A clean war is a fantasy, but an openly dirty war can poison the cause. So Washington continued to fight in his chosen way. He avoided decisive battles when the odds were wrong. He struck when the odds could be bent. He let the British sit on territory that bled them slowly. That strategy required patience from a public that wanted vengeance. It required endurance from soldiers who wanted home. It required trust in a leader who had already lost New York. So here is the question. How do you ask people to endure suffering for a strategy that looks, day by day, like retreat? When you stand far away in time, it is tempting to treat 1776 like a straight line toward inevitable victory. It was not. It was a cliff edge. In late 1776, the revolution was close to collapsing. Washington knew it. The British knew it. Many Americans felt it in their stomachs. That is why the victories at Trenton and Princeton matter so much. They were small on a map. They were huge inside the story. They kept the war alive long enough for bigger forces to shift, long enough for foreign powers to take the Americans seriously, long enough for the Continental Army to become something more than a temporary gathering. And in that larger arc, the New York fire becomes a dark mirror. One event showed the revolution's ability to destroy. The other showed its ability to endure. Both were born from desperation. Both were shaped by the same question. What will you do when the cause is dying? Washington's answer in practice was to accept hardship and risk instead of surrender. To preserve the army, even if it meant losing cities. To strike hard when the moment appeared, and to avoid, at least officially, turning the war into a campaign of deliberate burning. But history rarely gives us certainty about motives. We can trace decisions, we can read letters, we can weigh testimony, and still we face the same unresolved space where the fire once roared. So as the smoke clears and the winter marches fade into legend, one last question hangs in the air. If the revolution required Washington to gamble with lives and flirt with destruction, what did victory cost in ways we still refuse to name?